This video is about cognitive behavioral approaches to family counseling. So sometimes you will see those terms separated out where there's a focus on behavioral family therapy or family counseling, and sometimes you'll see them together with cognitive and behavioral appearing together. The approach pulls a lot of the techniques and theoretical premises and general approach from all of the names that you're hopefully already familiar with from thinking about cognitive behavioral counseling from an individual point of view. So those names would be Pavlov, Watson, Wolpe, Skinner, Beck, and Albert Ellis. Some folks that really focus specifically on working with the families would be Patterson, Lieberman, and Stewart. So Patterson was someone that's been associated with doing behavioral parent training. We have several resources in the bonus materials folder about parent training, parent education. It's very helpful to know how to do that, and sometimes counselors can have a nice little business on the side where they just provide parent education groups. Sometimes courts mandate people to attend parent education groups, and so that can be a nice little side business if you enjoy that. The major premise behind this method is that behavior is maintained by its consequences. So we take a look at what's going on in the social environment and what are the thought processes behind that, interpreting that social environment, behaviors, and expectations about people, and then what results from that cognitive process of incorporating perceptions and the being in a social environment is what determines our behavior. It's very much focused on what's happening now in the present moment. If there is a reflection on past behavior or past experiences, then it's usually with the understanding that there was learning that took place in past experiences that is still being played out right now. So maybe someone modeled behavior to a parent in their own childhood, and now that parent as an adult is carrying out that same bad behavior because that is what was modeled to them as a child. That's a little bit different than the looking into the past that a Freudian, a psychodynamic, or psychoanalytic approach would take, where the idea is to look into the past and to talk about early attachment relationships and past experiences for the purpose of developing insight into subconscious motives, unmet childhood needs, early development of self issues. So it kind of just a different perspective on that past behavior. You'll notice several words that pop up a lot in this approach, and that would be schemas, which are ideas about how we come to know something and can change over time. And then cognitive distortions, which are thoughts that really aren't rational. They don't really match how would be a functional way to think about people as they move through their environment. So in general, people strive to maximize rewards and minimize costs. So most people try to get the most out of a situation and do the least amount of work if that is considered to be a cost, or to avoid getting into trouble, and that those end up being things that determine our behavior. Treatment should always involve an analysis of what caused the function and what is maintaining it. So family counselors will use a lot of questions to determine what happened when this problematic behavior was initiated, and then what are the circumstances in the environment and the connections with others and thoughts that are maintaining that behavior to keep happening. And those would be considered rewards, and rewards are not necessarily always positive, or what we would think of as being positive. Family members can learn to emphasize positives and strengths in relationships. So that's a very optimistic point of view, and in counseling we tend to focus on the potential of development, and so this is an area where the family can do some cognitive development as a unit, and they can They don't have to be stuck in their problematic ways of thinking about each other and being with each other. They actually do have the potential to learn, grow, and to change. And then finally, relationship skills can be learned. That we actually can teach parents and husbands and wives and partners and siblings how to be kinder to each other, how to relate to each other better, how to fight fair. In relationships, distorted thoughts influence behavior, and each person is trying to protect themselves from getting hurt. And so that's a major part of why symptoms emerge. For children, poor behavior often gets reinforced. The negative attention can be of being scolded by a parent can actually be something that keeps that behavior going and would have to be replaced by other parental interactions that are more positive and not associated with the child's bad behavior. Healthy families, from this point of view, tend to take a balanced approach to giving and getting. They use effective communication and problem-solving skills most of the time. Not any one family uses effective communication and problem-solving skills all of the time, but the key is that most of the time. They have an ability to resolve conflict, and family members listen to and understand each other's points of view. Effective coping behaviors have been learned. So you see this word learning popping up in a couple of slides. That means that since there is so much emphasis on learning, that you as the family counselor operating under this model are going to be in the role of teaching other people to learn these skills. So in counseling, sometimes we kind of take on a role of doing a little bit of coaching, a little bit of even parenting, a little bit of education. And then this approach, it's a lot of focusing on being in that teaching role and providing education. Healthy couples, more specialized than just the previous slide, which was healthy families, tend to have a variety of shared activities. They have some common interests. They have an expansive sexual repertoire, meaning they don't always do the same thing when they're being intimate with each other. That communication is interesting to one another, and that they speak openly about their conflicts. And John Gottman, who did a lot of work on couples counseling, has found in years and years of his research observing couples and counseling couples that healthy couples do indeed fight. Sometimes they have unresolvable conflicts that they live with for their entire marriages. And so being conflict-free is not the goal, but it's to have open communication about the conflict and to be able to resolve conflict and move on. By contrast, dysfunctional families, there's little emphasis on family normality. There's not a good ratio of rewards in comparison to the amounts of negatives or withdrawals from the family. There's usually an over-reliance on coercive control and punishment, so parents really tend to focus too much on do this or else, or do this because I say so. And so rather than trying to teach kids how to behave, the parents assume this role of being much more authoritarian and much more mandating what behavior is. Of course, kids don't always respond to that very well, and there ends up being some problems. So dysfunctional families are also rigid, and they tend to be skewed. They don't have a lot of flexibility. There's not a lot of mutual accommodation, where sometimes we do things because that's the way that mom wants them done, or sometimes we do things because that's the way that dad wants them done. Sometimes we do things because this is good for the age that the kids are. So in a dysfunctional family, none of that would happen. None of that accommodation would happen. What would happen instead is we always do it dad's way, or everybody in the family is trying to jockey to do it their way. And then there's also a focus on tit-for-tat exchanges, where I'll do this if you do that. I did this for you, so you do that for me. That might look like mom trying to get a teenager to behave correctly by saying, I bought you some new clothes, so therefore you should be respectful to me. And that's kind of one of those tit for tat exchanges, and that's just not a very good approach. Doesn't work in the long term. So the therapist tends to be, as I mentioned before, in a very educative role, but also objective and not taking sides. Being very directive, that means that you're steering the session. It's not an open-ended type of format, but you are really steering the conversation by the questions that you're asking to identify the problem. And so you take a directive role in doing that. There might be more structured assessment. Sometimes assessment is very open-ended. Sometimes assessment includes the use of a genogram. And here, assessment might include actual pencil and paper types of questionnaires that the family is asked to fill out. The counselor also has a role in helping family members to learn to accept responsibility for their behaviors, to understand the impact that their behaviors have on each other. Oftentimes you'll meet with everyone in the family and then ask each of them how they view whatever the problem is or how the family is operating in general. And so that looks like, as opposed to other approaches of family counseling, that looks a lot like the counselor interviewing each of the family members one-on-one. They talk back and forth to the counselor rather than turning and talking to each other while the counselor is present. This is an important part, and this is actually one thing I really like about this approach, is that the idea is to tell families how counseling works. And this cognitive behavioral theory is one model of doing counseling that really emphasizes that, and I like that. Overall, I tend to not really believe that, it's been my experience that this approach does have some limitations with some families. However, it is very helpful in dealing with immediate problems and trying to get some immediate growth and change. So overall, as a counselor, you're going to want to identify what the family members, each of their cognitive distortions may be, and how they have maladaptive behavior patterns. So what is it that they're doing that is not functional, and what are they thinking about that is causing them to act in that way? Being flexible is a sign of a healthy family, so you want to try to encourage the family, praise them, that's a reward, reinforce good behavior such as flexibility, good communication skills, and positive control techniques. One example of a method that a cognitive behavioral couples counselor might use would be this idea of contingency contracting. And that's where couples list the behaviors that they desire in each other, and then they take note of how often the other spouse displays that behavior. And that from that they really start to join with each other, start to connect better, start to experience more positives than negatives in the relationship. And going back to Gottman's work on couples counseling again, there really should be a bigger ratio of positives overall than there are negatives. And so for every one negative remark that a couple says to each other, one snide comment, one nagging comment, one scolding remark, there should be at least 5 positives that counter that. A compliment, a showing of appreciation, an expression of love, and so forth. The positives really need to outweigh the negatives. And there are some ways that this approach can be used with children, but because the power differential and expectations of that relationship and guardianship are different than in a couple's relationship, it's not a directly transferable approach or technique, this contingency contracting. So that is a little bit of information about cognitive behavioral therapy. There are many, many resources online on our Blackboard site if this is something that you enjoy and would like to learn more about.